Uh, uh, am I gonna die? The kid asked me as he was being rolled into the operating theater. It was a question I'd heard 1,000 times before, but answering it truthfully hasn't become any easier, even after years at the hospital. Of course not. We're gonna fix you right up, I lied. He'd been crushed in a horrific car accident, and though we would put all of our efforts into saving his life, hope was a limited resource. The fact that he even remained conscious despite losing most of his blood was bizarre enough, but after 10 years on the job, nothing surprised me anymore. The anesthesiologist quickly put him under while we scrubbed in for surgery. Damien would be the surgeon, a specialist in polytrauma cases, and I'd assist. No sooner had we opened him up before we shared a look of disappointment. There was no chance in hell he'd survive through surgery. Despite our lack of faith, we tried our best, but after only half an hour on the table, his heart gave out. How was he still alive when he arrived? Damien asked. He pronounced the time of death and left us to clean up the mess. I took the responsibility of cleaning the kid up for the morgue, a task I'd committed to countless times before. It wasn't something I personally enjoyed, but to me it was my final chance to pay respect to the dead. The kid couldn't have been more than 15, and as I'd heard, he was just learning to drive. Unexperienced and attempting his first drive on a slippery road, he managed to steer off into a ditch. His father died on impact, but he himself lived long enough to face surgery. As I put the needle to his open abdomen, his body twitched for a moment. I retracted the needle in surprise, wondering what had caused a post-mortem spasm. Then, the boy suddenly gasped for air as his eyes shot open. He let out the most violent scream imaginable as he suddenly returned to life. "Help me!" he begged with a guttural voice as I stumbled back in panic and slipped onto the floor. I called for help and the rest of the team came running into the operating theater, each panicking as they witnessed the dead boy scream on the operating table. His spine was fractured, so though he yelled in agony, he could do nothing to move. The anesthesiologist quickly attempted to sedate him while we were checking his vitals. Despite all evidence pointing to the contrary, his heart had not started beating again. He was supposed to be dead. I started chest compressions, desperately trying to get his heart going. I cringed at the sound of his ribs cracking beneath my hands, and the boy's screams turned to gargles as he was unable to gasp for another breath. "He's not going under!" the anesthesiologist yelled as he gave the kid a second dose of propofol. Of course, without a functioning heart, there'd be no way for the drug to flow through his veins, even as I tried my best to pump for him. After an hour of compressions, the chief of surgery had intervened and ordered us to stop. At that point, we caused more damage than we helped. "What's happening to me?" the kid stuttered, still conscious. None of us responded. We couldn't find any words to describe the horrific sight before us. Most of the staff had left, due to the sight. We'd faced many challenges in our career, but nothing quite like this. "What's your name?" I asked, despite already having seen it in his file. I just wanted him to focus. Brian Dawson," he responded. I took a deep breath, doing my best to keep my composure. "You were in an accident, Brian." His eyes darted frantically around the room as he started to realize where he was. He tried to lift his neck, but due to the spinal fracture, he was completely paralyzed. I can't move. I can't move," he cried. I walked closer, standing directly above him. "Brian, your heart isn't beating," I said. The chief of surgery, George, grabbed me by my shoulder and whispered into my ear. "We need to isolate the OR. Whatever's happening here is beyond us, and it could be contagious," George said. He rushed into the preparation room and picked up the phone. Through the glass door, I couldn't hear what he said, but I assumed he was calling security to shut down the ward. What about my father?" Brian asked, trying to hold back tears. I was taken aback by his question. I just told him his heart was destroyed and that he was essentially dead. Yet his first concern was regarding his father. "I'm sorry, Brian. He died on impact." He sobbed quietly. "So what's gonna happen to me? I'm gonna die, aren't I?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. I'd never been in any similar situation, so I just gave the only answer I thought might be of some comfort. "You're not alone, Brian. I'm staying here until the end." George had been quick to shut down the operating theater, and the Center for Disease Control had long since been alerted to our situation. We had nothing to do but to wait and pray to any god that Brian wasn't contagious. I had already been exposed, so I examined Brian, checking for any chance of improving his situation. "Can you feel this?" I asked as I checked all of his limbs. "Not a thing," he responded, "but it just hurts so much on the inside." "Where exactly does it hurt?" I asked. "Everywhere. Please do something." I gave Brian a dose of fentanyl, but without a heartbeat to move the drug around, I had little hope it would take any effect at all. To keep him distracted from the pain, I asked mundane things about life, what his hobbies were, and family stuff. He was smart enough to realize my intentions, but went along with it, either out of fear or because he actually hoped someone could save him. Hours passed while we waited for someone to tell us what to do. Half the surgical staff had been put into quarantine, terrified that he might be infected. Finally, the CDC arrived on the scene, fully geared in hazmat suits. They allowed us to roll Brian into his own space. A pre-operation room had been evacuated, so he could stay somewhat comfortable. The rest of us would be put into the surgical office while the situation was being assessed. I decided to stay with Brian. No one should have to suffer alone, especially with the CDC agents probing him with all sorts of needles, enthusiastically taking samples. The only reason they allowed me to stay was because I kept him relatively calm. We talked through the night. After the procedures were finished, I couldn't sleep. I doubt Brian was physically capable of it. "My eyes feel a bit weird," he said. "Do they hurt?" "No. The edges are just kind of blurry. It's weird." I left to talk to George, who was still working around the clock, calling around and making sure the other patients were redirected elsewhere. "What if we put the kid on a heart and lung machine?" I asked. George put the phone down for a moment and sighed. "Then what? He has no functioning liver. His aorta is cut into pieces and his intestines are shredded. Even if we get him a new heart, he'd never survive." George responded, "Just keep him company while you can." I knew he was right, but some of my professional knowledge was put aside due to the insane nature of the situation. "Doctor!" Brian shouted. I rushed to his side. I can't see," he stuttered. I pulled out a flashlight and examined his eyes. Both of his pupils were unresponsive, and his eyes had started to almost deflate, which was one of the stages of decomposition. Brian had started to rot. "Please, I'm so scared." Brian was a brave kid, but he started to lose his composure, just like everyone else in the ward. I kept talking to him, but the inevitable truth was that if he kept decomposing, he'd soon lose all of his senses, all the while being conscious to experience it. As horrible as it might sound, I begged that it finally might allow him to pass on. We kept talking. I asked him if there's anyone he wanted to call, but as I already knew from the others, Brian's mother had died during childbirth, and his father had been in the same accident as himself. As we talked, Brian's voice kept getting louder and louder, as if he was struggling to hear. "Are you hearing me all right?" I asked. "What did you say?" Brian yelled. His hearing had deteriorated within minutes, going from impaired to deafness, before I could even begin to help. With him being blind and deaf, we no longer had a way of communicating. No matter my attempts, I couldn't comfort the dying kid, and the CDC quickly decided that my presence had become unnecessary. Brian kept screaming in terror and agony after I left. For each passing second, his own body started digesting itself. and nothing we could do would take the pain away. By the morning, his screams had silenced. I barged into the room, much to the dismay of the agents. Brian was hooked up to hundreds of cables, monitoring his heart, brain, muscles, and vital values. Of course, his heart showed no activity, and the decay had progressed to shut down all of his muscles. He had quieted down, not because the pain was gone, but because he wasn't able to scream anymore. The only part of his body that was still working was his brain. "What the hell happened?" I asked. "Get him out of here!" one of the men demanded. The other man complied, but went outside with me to explain the situation. "You don't have to worry about it being contagious. We'll lift the quarantine in a moment," he said. He looked weirdly somber as he spoke those words. "What about Brian? What'll happen to him?" "He's still conscious, but he has no respiratory function anymore, so we have no means of communicating with him." Brian was still alive, blind, deaf, and dumb. He had to suffer in loneliness, unable to die. "How long does he have to suffer?" I asked. "We'll know more when we move him to our specialized facility." The senior CDC agent then demanded that his colleague kept quiet before they could tell me anything else. They left with Brian, covered him in an airtight capsule, so no one would see the horrors that just occurred within our surgical ward. As soon as the quarantine was lifted, I headed home to write up my letter of resignation. I had a well-connected contact with the CDC, but upon trying to get more information, he claimed no such case had ever been presented to them, that no one had ever been admitted to their facility under the name of Brian Dawson. About a month later, a lawyer, accompanied by a doctor, showed up at my door with a bunch of documents, all regarding doctor-patient confidentiality. The lawyer looked tired, worked down to the bone, as if he'd made many such trips before. He asked me to sign the documents and to never speak of this again, saying I'd lose my medical license if I did. Not that it mattered to me. I'm done in that field for good. I was given an injection by the doctor. He told me that Brian's disease was not unfamiliar to them, and that it was extremely contagious, but only upon death. He explained that half the population is infected with the disease that keeps the brain conscious for hours, even days following death. Brian's case was special, in the sense that he actually retained some motor function and was able to speak to us. The injection given was not a cure. It'll only prevent me from spreading the disease. But once I die, I'll suffer a fate similar to Brian's. I just hope someone will stay with me when it happens. Mr. Miller was a dick. Excuse my language, but I really hated that guy. He was the type of old guy that'd scream at you for getting too close to his lawn when you were just walking by on the sidewalk, or complain that kids playing in their own front yard were being too loud. One time, Mr. Miller came over to our house to argue with my parents over a package he was convinced we had stolen because it didn't come when he thought it would. The guy was here for nearly an hour before going home and subsequently receiving his package. To this day, it bothers me that despite the numerous security cameras set up around his house, he chose to have a pointless argument instead of watching his own footage. The guy was fucking awful. I'm pretty sure he had it out for the whole street, and he definitely made that known. My parents had always advised me to stay away from his house, and for the most part I listened. Admittedly, there were times he'd push me a little too far, so I take it upon myself to sign him up for a bunch of spam mail or make fake accounts online with his face and start stuff with strangers online. One particular time I was playing on the basketball hoop outside, and my ball had bounced into his front yard. I cursed myself for my poor aim and contemplated a strategy to pick to retrieve my ball. This basically amounted to me checking to see if he was in the window, and then bolting to the grass to get it. As soon as I touched his yard, he sprinted out of the house screaming at me to get the fuck off his property. I yelled back that I needed my ball, and he kept shouting about how he didn't care and just leave. I picked it up and ran back inside, where I watched him walk furiously to our porch and pound ferociously on the door. My dad ran downstairs asking what was going on. I explained the situation as best as I could, and he just rolled his eyes and calmly opened up the door. But before he could even get a word out, Mr. Miller went on a tirade about how I needed to stay away from his home and how I was being incredibly disrespectful by leaving stuff on his property. My dad simply stood and nodded while being yelled at and then calmly apologized. Unsatisfied, Mr. Miller nodded and took a step back off the porch. Beet red, he looked at my dad dead in the eyes, pointed at his house, and coldly stated, "I'm gonna buy a fucking gun and shoot the next kid that steps onto my fucking yard." Shocked, my dad paused for a second before screaming at him to stay away from us, and that if he threatened us again, he'd be willing to go to jail to end the situation. He then informed Mr. Miller he'd be calling the police, but the old man waved him off and stormed home. Within the next 15 minutes, an officer showed up to take statements. From the window, I could see Mr. Miller yelling and furiously pointing towards our house. The officer came back and told us that Mr. Miller didn't seem serious about the gun thing, but that they'd keep a note of it and let them know if anything else happened. My parents sat my sister and me down that night and told us that we should still do our best to avoid Mr. Miller's house, even though we hadn't done anything. That meant not playing basketball on our hoop and walking on the other side of the street to get home so that he couldn't complain. They knew it was a bit much on our part, but they were less concerned about what we actually did as opposed to what he thought we'd do. And despite the disappointment of having to live our lives around him, we understood. Over time, avoiding his house became routine. Whenever he'd do something odd in plain view, we'd watch for a brief moment before turning away, not wanting to accidentally catch his eye. That was until he started wearing his gun around. I remember the first day I saw it. He was doing some yard work and I was riding down the street on my bike. The mere glance at the big shotgun slung around his back made me stop in the middle of the road. I think I was stopped with my jaw hung open for a whole 10 seconds. All I could remember was staring at the deadly piece of metal on Mr. Miller's back. I sped home, nearly destroying my pedals as I went. As soon as I saw my door, I threw my bike onto the yard and raced up to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I quickly texted my parents and told them what I had seen. As soon as they got home, they comforted me and told me it was going to be okay, but there was simply no way for me to trust that they were right. Later that night, I listened in on them talking about what to do, and they were both at a loss. They came to the agreement that the only thing to do was to inform the police. They both knew it wouldn't be safe to go onto his property and talk to him about the weapon, and they legally couldn't make him relinquish it. As far as I was concerned, I figured the only thing I could do was warn my friends and remind everyone to be on their absolute best behavior. Surprisingly, everything was pretty typical for the next month or so. No children had turned up missing, and for me, that was a win. At least until the evening, we heard a gunshot from next door. My parents scrambled to me and my sister's rooms to grab us and lock us in with them. They called the police and we waited together until the officers came to the door. Unsurprisingly, the whole damn neighborhood had phoned it in. But surprisingly, Mr. Miller was nowhere to be found. It actually wasn't until hours later when he pulled back into his driveway. He explained to the police that he had been out on a late-night drive and had nothing to do with the shooting. Since no one was awake to deny this, they asked him for his security camera footage. Mr. Miller claimed that the cameras were having issues and therefore were shut off. There wasn't much they could do as there was no evidence, and for what felt like the millionth time, they left without taking him in handcuffs. Though we were disappointed he wasn't at least taken in for questioning, there was still the big question of who or what got shot. We got our answer a couple days later, when one of our local neighbors, Miss Ramirez, noticed her dog was missing. This was strange, considering her dog was kept behind a near inescapable gated fence. This is until she noticed the gate was broken and her dog was gone. I remember coming out to see her screaming at him from his porch. Apparently, the two had multiple encounters in the past. Miss Ramirez was accusing Mr. Miller of taking her dog and then killing him out in the woods. He, of course, denied the allegations and slammed the door in her face. From the rumors around school, Mrs. Ramirez had gone down to the station to beg the police to do something, but without the body, there just wasn't enough evidence. As shitty as it sounds, they weren't about to go on a manhunt for a missing dog. We felt awful about what happened. As much as we wished we could confront Mr. Miller, no one wanted to risk setting him off. No one could have predicted how it all come to a head during the waning days of summer. My friend Andy and I were biking down the sidewalk when we saw a family walking towards us. As we made the move to bike on the street, Andy lost control and made an emergency turn into the first soft landing spot he could. That soft landing spot just so happened to be Mr. Miller's yard. I remember seeing the torn up grass as he and his bike dug into the freshly made lawn. I remember screaming, "Shit," as I slapped my hands on my head while lying there, collecting himself. I was about to run and grab him, but as soon as I did, I saw the terrifying old man step from his porch. I froze in fear. "Oh my God!" he yelled. In a fit of rage, he rushed towards Andy, arms outstretched and gun swinging from the strap on his back. Everything happened so quickly. The next thing I knew, Mr. Miller had his arm wrapped tightly around Andy's neck. I could see him struggling against the surprising strength of Mr. Miller as he was dragged into the house. I sprinted over to grab my friend, but stopped short when he flashed a small knife. I could see tears rolling down Andy's eyes as he screamed and furiously fought to free himself. And in just a few short seconds, they were gone. I immediately called the police to report the hostage and waited for what felt like hours until they came. But the tension of waiting for them to arrive was nothing compared to when they went into the house. I could hear screaming and a gunshot, some return fire, and then silence. To my relief, Mr. Miller was eventually brought out in handcuffs. I remember him giving me a nasty scowl as he walked by. Andy was brought out mere moments later. His neck was bruised, but luckily he was okay otherwise. The one thing that has stuck with me most happened after the police had raided his home, taken numerous bags out, and left the scene. Knowing no one was there, I decided it was worth taking a look inside Mr. Miller's house. It was absolutely disgusting. The man was definitely a hoarder. Rotten food was everywhere. Trash was piling up, and there was a smell that would make you intensely ill if you hung around it long enough. I tried to think back to what I saw earlier that day. I remember the bag smelling of something foul as they passed by me, but when I looked inside, it was beyond what I could have ever contemplated. Pieces of cats and dogs were chopped up and strewn about the stove. I didn't know if he had been feasting on them or if he gained some sort of sick amusement from it. Whenever I tried to talk to Andy about what he saw in there, he just shook his head and silently told me he never wanted to talk about it. Since that day, I've always gotten this dark feeling in the pit of my stomach. What if he was waiting for a kid to do something like that? He had always come out so quickly whenever one of us got too close. It would have been easy for him to monitor us from his security cameras, right? Maybe there was a reason he tried to drag Andy into his house instead of scaring him away. I don't know. I could be getting ahead of myself since I don't have any proof. The thought just scares me. Still, though, I can't help but shake the feeling that there was a decent chance that Andy nearly ended up like Miss Ramirez's dog. Mr. Ronan, I would like to inform you that the federal government does not take kindly to having its valuable time and resources wasted on this break of yours. A stern-faced, bald, yet exceptionally well-dressed man in a suit said, with much irritation in his voice. I'm not wasting your time. If you would just listen to my story, then you would think otherwise, I promise. Mr. Nolan, right? Just hear me out, okay? And just call me Ben. Ben pleaded desperately, as the other agents started towards him, one with cuffs in his hand. Nolan, however, stopped them and let out an exasperated sigh. Fine. I could use a good laugh anyway. Okay, Ben. You said you were abducted by aliens. What exactly happened in this dream of yours? Nolan sarcastically said, with a slight smile on his lips. Ben leaned forward in his chair, suddenly eyeing Nolan with a more threatening tone to his voice. It wasn't a dream. Hell, I wish it was. Ben chuckled sadly before continuing. I was walking home from my part-time job at the supermarket at around 3 a.m. I'm a stock boy, you see. Nolan nodded, riveting. Go on. Right. Well, I was on the side of the road when I saw an odd triangular ship thing floating damn near 100 feet in the air. It appeared out of nowhere and didn't make a sound. Ben paused to gauge the reactions in the room, but Nolan and his group looked quite unimpressed so far. Disheartened, he continued with the story as he scratched at his right forearm. Are you all right? Nolan asked quizzically, staring at the younger man's increasingly reddening skin. Yeah, I'm okay. Anyway, the next thing I knew, an enormous spotlight shone down on me, and I found myself unable to move as I was, levitated up onto the ship. Excuse me for a second. Ben went into his kitchen, pulled out a thick bag of ice from his freezer and laid it across his arm. That's more like it. Sorry about that. Nolan didn't say anything, but he did place a hand on his sidearm. Continue. I've got your attention now, don't I? I knew it. Ben laughed before he kept going. Once I was up in their craft, I, met the aliens. What did they look like? Nolan asked coolly, feigning his once genuine disinterest. Ben's previous excitement faded, and his face had gone pale as he remembered the extra-galactic visitor's appearance. After a few awkward moments, Nolan asked once again, reminding him not to waste his time. Okay, right. God, they were... I don't even know where to begin. Start from the top and work down, Ben. Its head was white, blank. No facial features to speak of except for a small dot at the center of its face that glowed yellow, and a small black line descending from that to its chin. He paused, looking at his arm. Look, I really don't want to go beyond that. I changed my mind. I don't want to talk about this. Ben started to tear up and moved the bag of ice away so that he could scratch at his arm again. Only now, his skin was bleeding, and small bits of flesh were getting stuck in his fingernails. Nolan cocked his head to the side and softly demanded that Ben finish the description of the aliens. I don't want to. Get out of my house. I regret calling you guys here. Just go. Nolan slammed his fists on the table in response. You don't get to fucking decide that now. You made your bed. Now lay in it. Or I swear to God, you'll live to regret not finishing this story. Do you understand me? Ben nodded between his sobs and proceeded with describing the rest of the alien. Its head was fine for what it was, but its body... Holy shit, it was like an amalgamation of every horror you could ever dream of. I wanted to vomit as soon as I saw it. Fuck. Okay. Its body was extremely overweight. Its white skin was nearly bursting at the seams. An odd liquid was oozing out of holes in its skin as dozens of spiked tentacles thrashed and wiggled about incessantly. Fuck! Ben tore at his arm, scratching up layer after layer of his skin. The agents around Nolan exchanged concerned looks, preparing themselves for the worst. "What did they do to you, Ben?" Nolan stood up, his eyes wild as he was desperately wanting to hear certain answers from this poor soul. "One of them. Its body stretched and made a disgusting croaking sound as it surrounded me, coiling my body as a snake would. God, those tentacles slathered all over, cutting at my skin as its oily skin pressed up against mine. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Damn it!" "Stay with me, Ben. What happened next? It's extremely important that you tell me what exactly they did next." Blood began dripping from Ben's nose and eyes as he stared up at Nolan, tiny tentacles swarming out from any available orifice. "Sir, what's going on?" The two other agents in the room asked frightfully to Nolan as they drew their guns on Ben. "Stand down! Ben, you need to finish, now!" Nolan shouted, sweat dripping down his head. Its head opened up, revealing a mass of blue flesh, and a flesh tube shot out from its throat directly down my own. It injected me with... fuck if I know. Next thing I knew, I was back in my bed, and then the next day I called the FBI office downtown. I didn't think this was going to happen. What the fuck is happening to me?" Ben's speech became distorted as he let out a guttural cry before lunging across the table at Nolan, who promptly backed up. A plethora of tentacles sprang up out of the arm Ben had been scratching at. Those fleshy appendages writhed around as Ben's body began to twist, crack, and contort into the creature he had described. "Shit! Open fire! Now!" Nolan ordered, as he and his agents unleashed a wall of lead at the entity in front of them until their clips were emptied and it had stopped moving. Nobody said anything, just stared at the corpse on the table. "Sir, what... was his story true? Then, does that mean..." Nolan pulled out a second pistol and shot both men in the head before they could react. "I'm afraid that's classified." Nolan took a deep breath and went outside to light a cigarette. After taking a few drags, he pulled out a satellite phone as he stared out at the rows and rows of corn stalks around the house and dialed a number. Thank God the house was away from the city. It would have been a real shit show otherwise. A person on the other end answered, interrupting his thoughts. "Yeah, it's Nolan. We've got a possible infestation here in Kansas. I'm gonna need backup at my coordinates, and bring some body bags. My agents had to be disposed of." "Good. I'll be here on standby then. Goodbye." Nolan took a final drag before flicking the cigarette to the ground and stomping it out. Poor kid never stood a chance. Wish I didn't have to kill my subordinates too, but it's better they don't see what's coming. God knows I don't want to. I was born into one of those old families of the South, the kind that has long since toppled and decayed, attempting desperately to hold itself together. We'd had money, once, as evidenced by the grand old buildings that sat on our property, but the old barns and guest houses sat empty and abandoned, choked with cobwebs, weeds, and Spanish moss. The forest had begun to reclaim the property. My family was like many others of its kind, a long winding lineage marked with rape, slavery, and pain. But one thing set us apart. There were no women in my family. I had no mother, no sisters or grandmothers. Every member of my family was male. My 5 brothers and I never thought it strange, though. We were uneducated and mostly separated from the outside world. Our days were spent laboring on the decaying property, all of our efforts inevitably useless. when we weren't plucking weeds or clearing out the decades of trash from the various buildings. We played. The quasi-wilderness of our home was a perfect stage for our games. My father was a kind man, but strict. Our self-contained life came with a strange set of rules. There was a chapel on the property, a small white thing half hidden in the woods. It was in better condition than anything else due to my father's doting care. We were not allowed inside the chapel without him, however. A padlock on the door prevented us from sneaking in. We were, on occasion, allowed to go to town. It was a half-hour walk through the woods to get there, and excursions were highly anticipated. There were conditions, though. We had to stick together, and we were not allowed to talk to women. We could talk to men and the other boys, but my father strictly forbade us from talking to women, girls, even old maids. He instructed us to say hello and good day, and yes ma'am and thank you ma'am, like good southern boys. But other than that, not a word. This was weird, of course, but everyone in our town seemed to abide by these rules as well. The women would give us curt nods and avoid us otherwise. It was so ingrained into our daily lives that none of us ever questioned it. It wasn't going to work forever, of course. My oldest brother, Jamie, started making eyes at the pretty girl who worked at the drugstore ice cream counter. She made eyes back. Soon, he was sneaking off to be with her during our visits. He would leave my brothers and I at the drugstore or the park, buying our silence with penny candy and ice cream. Jamie's little tryst didn't last long, though. Laszlo, the second youngest, had always been loose-lipped. One day when we came back from town, our father asked us what we did.
"Jamie snuck off,"
Laszlo blurted.
"He always goes and sneaks off to see that ice cream girl."
Pa's face grew very pale. He turned to Jamie and seized him by the shoulders. "Is that true?" he asked, in a voice that was much too quiet. "You seeing a girl?" A tense silence hung over us. Jamie opened his mouth and then closed it. "Jamie, come join me on the porch," Pa said icily. My father never hit us. I want to make that clear. But when he was truly angry or upset, he had a way of talking that cut you to the bone, that made you feel like absolute dog shit. When I was really little and got into trouble, I would hide and cry for hours afterwards, consumed by guilt. Jamie and Pa went onto the porch. The rest of us dispersed throughout the house. The happy mood of the day soured. For a couple weeks afterwards, we beat on Laszlo, especially hard, and gave him the worst rolls in our games. After that, he mostly kept his mouth shut. Jamie returned with a pale face. He didn't talk to any of us until the morning, where he tried to act like nothing had happened. I caught him alone that day. I tugged on his sleeve and asked him, "What did Pa say to you the other night?" Jamie looked down at me. His face suddenly seemed very old, but he gave me a weak smile and tousled my hair. "Not your business," he said. "Don't worry about it." I wasn't in the habit of displeasing my older brother, so I went along with my life. The next time we went to town, the ice cream girl batted her eyes at Jamie, but he stared straight ahead, and she frowned sadly. She wasn't as nice to us after that. There isn't much else to say of my childhood. It was unique, surely, but we had always lived our lives that way, and I was not the questioning type. Our existence continued rather uneventfully for years. My brothers and I cleaned old houses that would never be occupied, and weeded yards that would never be used. The forest grew in faster than we could pluck. Then came the day when Jamie turned 18. Birthdays were frequent in a family of 7, but turning 18, that was special, according to Pa. On the special day, Pa got us all up early and scrubbed our faces with a spit-wet cloth. He made us put on our best clothes, moth-eaten from disuse. He gave Jamie one of his old suits, and it hung baggy on his thin frame. Then, We gathered in the chapel. Inside, the air was still and silent. I remember feeling disappointed at the sight of the perfectly normal interior. I always expected there to be some great, terrible secret that my father was guarding, but it was just an old chapel. We sat in the front pew, all in a row. Pa and Jamie hung back at the door. They exchanged some quiet words, and then began to walk. They marched arm in arm, staring stiffly ahead. They stepped in time to some silent rhythm. Slowly, they made their way up to the aisle. My father bent behind the pulpit, and the sound of creaking wood broke the terse silence. He had opened a trap door. Pa and Jamie, still arm in arm, descended into the door. Downstairs we couldn't see from our angle. My brothers and I sat uncomfortably in the pew, restless but still quiet. I felt a strange swelling sensation, like something enormous was happening that I couldn't comprehend. I channeled this by plucking wildly at the loose threads of my ill-fitting pants. My brothers and I sat nervously for a long while, until Pa emerged again, alone. He shut the trap door behind him. "Time to go home, boys," he said. I wanted to ask where Jamie was, but my tongue felt heavy. Instead, I fell into step behind him, and we made a solemn procession back to the rotting mansion where we lived. Jamie was there the next morning, snoring in his bed next to mine. We all scrutinized him for some change, but he was the same Jamie he'd always been. The only answer to our questions we received was a hard sock in the arm when we bothered him too much. A few months later, Pa came into our room in the middle of the night. I had been lying awake, but I pretended to sleep as he quietly roused Jamie and let him out the door. I dozed very lightly, only to be reawoken when I heard them coming back up the stairs. Jamie made his way to his bed slowly. In the faint moonlight, I could see his shoulders were shaking. He crawled under the covers. I could hear the muffled sound of him sobbing. After that, Jamie was different. He was withdrawn and angry. He stopped playing with us and was quick to yell. There was an angry tension between him and Pa. Even as young as I was, I knew the change had something to do with that strange place in the chapel. I wouldn't have to wait long to find out the secret of our family. After all, I was the second oldest. My birthday came that November. I remember every second of that day. Pa woke me before my brothers. He brought me into the master suite where he spent the nights of his lonely existence. The room might have once been grand, but now the walls were ashy with cigarette smoke, and it smelled like stale living. The bed sheets were rumpled on only one side. It made me sad to think of Pa sleeping alone every night in that huge, moth-eaten bed. Pa dressed me in the same suit that Jamie had worn. It fit me a little better. I was fuller and shorter than he was. I looked in the mirror and felt a flash of pride. I was a proper gentleman for once, like those clean-cut men in the old magazines we sometimes found while cleaning. No longer a dirty-faced little boy. Pa stepped back after fixing my tie, his eyes shining. The harsh line of his mouth wobbled as he rubbed his thumb across my cheekbone. "I am so proud of you," he said, and hugged me. My chest swelled with warmth and pride. We walked through the woods to the little white chapel. It was cool, and the woods were alive and red and orange. My brothers gathered in the pews, while Pa and I waited outside the doors. He looped his arm through mine and looked at me. "Just follow my lead," he murmured, patting my arm. His words soothed me. The doors of the chapel swung open on their own, and the sound of church bells echoed through the woods, though the rusty bell in the tower sat still. But I wasn't afraid. Pa walked me down the aisle towards the empty pulpit. We walked in time to the toll of the bells, something I realized only the two of us could hear. My brothers whispered and fidgeted in the pew. Jamie sat on the far end, staring straight ahead, his eyes dull and back stiff. We ascended. Behind the pulpit lay the secret trap door, ancient and moldered. Pa gave the rusted brass ring a mighty pull, and it opened with a creak. Before us lay a stone staircase, riddled with cracks and dappled with moss and mushrooms. The shallow stairs led into the dark. For the first time that day, I felt something other than anticipation and pride. I was afraid, but I think, looking back, that I would have been unable to leave if I tried. Pa and I walked carefully down the stairs. He still held tight to my arm. We emerged into an earthen tunnel, tall enough for us to walk upright, though roots from the ceiling brushed our heads. For a moment, we stood still. There was a strange sputtering sound, and a breeze blew from the darkness ahead. That should have been impossible, as the tunnel seemed to only go deeper into the ground. But as the breeze came, so did light. Alcoves had been scooped into the earthen walls, and tens of candles suddenly burst to life in their wax-filled recesses. I jumped as the sudden light revealed hundreds of moths. They took off, excited by the flame. Their soft wings flapped and brushed against my cheek. As Pa and I walked down the tunnel, my apprehension grew. I started shaking. Pa stood resolute by my side, his presence steadying. I don't know how long we walked in silence. The tunnel was not without its own sound. The pop of fat from the candles, the drip of moisture from the ceiling, the tamping of our shoes and the fluttering of moth wings. They landed on my shoulders and my head and bounced off my face often. I wanted to ask Pa where we were going, but yet again, I stayed silent. Soon, I became aware of a faint sweet smell. Almost at the same time, the candlelight revealed a door. Moths were clustered around it so thickly that it appeared the frame was made of a canvas of pale, shivering wings. Pa turned to me. In the flickering candlelight, the hollows of his face were cast in sharp relief. He looked more like an ape than a man. "This is where I leave you, son," he said. He put his hands on my shoulder. "Don't be afraid. You won't be hurt, I promise. Just do what nature tells you to do." He saw that I was shaking, and he laid his hand on my face. "This is our family's legacy, Eli. Jamie did this. I did this. My father before me did this. It's as old and ancient as our blood. Older, even. Nothing is going to harm you." "Okay," I choked out. My father smiled wanly, then turned and left me before the door. He disappeared back the way we came, and I was alone. Cautiously, I pushed open the stone door. The moths fluttered away from it, forming a cloud that I had to bat away to see. The chamber that I emerged into was huge. The walls were lined with hundreds of alcoves with candles burning bright, and more candles were spread across the floor. Across from me, there was a great white bed, surrounded by gossamer curtains. The sweet smell was overpowering, undercut by something primal and funky, like body odor. Then, the bed moved. From its side unfolded pairs of strange appendages. I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. They were arms, human arms, ending in human hands. But they bent in too many places, and they were too long and pale. Long tendrils like feathers flared from their elbows. It wasn't a bed. It was a person, perhaps in the loosest sense of the word. Its body was huge, white, and bloated. What I had thought were pillows were actually huge, pendulous breasts, bare of nipples. The swell of bed's comforter was a huge stomach, sagging down to the ground in ripples of white flesh. As I watched, a pair of the arms reached to gently pat the gossamer curtains, like a bride lifting a veil. Its face. How to describe its face? Once, cleaning trash out of our house, I found an old china doll. It had a puffy, exaggerated expression of innocence, though time had worn the paint from its face and gave it only the barest imitation of humanity. The creature's face looked like that doll, but its eyes were large and bulging, and completely black. Most notably of all, from its forehead sprouted a pair of long, feathery antennae. They were as long as its arms, reaching towards the high ceiling. They waved back and forth gently like ferns. As I took it in, stunned by the wrongness of it all, the creature smiled at me. Its pale, fleshy lips parted, revealing a dripping black mouth with no teeth. And then it spoke.
"Hello, sweet Elias,"
it said. The voice was so wrong. The intonation and words were clearly English, the voice feminine, but it had a weird buzz to it, and a thick quality like someone speaking with their throat blocked. I was somehow able to find my own voice.
"What are you? How do you know my name?"
A strange buzzing and clicking sound came from the creature. The fat on its body rolled like waves, and the toothless mouth gaped wider. It was laughing.
"I am you. You were the fruit of my loins. I birthed your brothers and your father, and your father's father, and his father before him. I know every inch of you, your flesh, for it grew and pupated within me. Now, the time has come for you to give of yourself, so I may have your son."
I understood almost immediately. I felt a mix of horror and revulsion, but it was far off, suppressed. The sweet smell filled my nostrils. It made my head swim. My skin was hot and itchy in the ill-fitting suit. I should have been terrified. I should have been disgusted. I am, in retrospect. But I was under the spell of the creature. The scent of its pheromones too powerful for my brain to comprehend. In that moment, I knew that my body served a singular purpose, and I knew what that purpose was. Then I was before the creature. Its many arms petted my hair, my body, my face, the soft feathers tickling me. It cooed and spoke to me as I climbed on top of it, my body sinking into its soft and yielding flesh. I lay on its stomach, its bosom as my pillow. Lying against its skin, though it was tacky like dough, I felt a comfort I had never known, nor have ever known since. I was safe. I was swaddled. I was loved. It wrapped its spindly arms around me, its buzzing words of encouragement burrowing into my brain like worms. And then I began to move my hips, and I was in heaven. I'll spare you the mechanical details of that coupling. Me recalling having sex with a moth monster who was also apparently my mother and grandmother is just as traumatizing as you reading about it. But what I must say is that I have never felt pleasure like that since. I have never once felt so held, so loved, and so safe. I know now that I wasn't in my right mind, and recalling it makes me nauseous. But there are still nights I jolt awake feeling a ghost of that heavenly pleasure, and for a moment I grieve that I'll never feel it again. I don't know how long I was in the chamber with that thing. I vaguely remember dressing myself slowly, still drunk from the pheromones in the air. I remember the creature rubbing its belly as I left, followed by a cloud of moths. I slept dreamlessly for hours and hours. Over dinner, I made eye contact with Pa as I was shoveling spaghetti into my mouth. He beamed at me proudly, and I felt good. But Jamie was also looking at me. He didn't return my smile, his mouth now permanently set in a grim line. As the encounter with the moth creature faded like a dream, Jamie continued to bother me. Hadn't he experienced the same heavenly pleasure I'd had? Sure, there were lingering dregs of fear and even disgust at what I'd done. But if everyone in our family had done it, what was the harm? It was our legacy, after all. More time passed, and my confusion turned to anger. Jamie barely interacted with us anymore. Did he think he was better than us? Did he think that his feelings made him separate from the family somehow? I never got the chance to confront him. He came to me. It was about 5 months after my 18th birthday. Life had continued as normal. But one morning when we woke up, there was a strange feeling in the air. I made a comment about it to my brothers, but they just looked at me blankly. As we went about our chores, I felt strangely happy. We were walking out of one of the old guest houses when Jamie grabbed me roughly by the arm and pulled me away. He was nearly nose to nose with me, and his eyes were bright and wild.
"You listen good now, Eli,"
he hissed.
"Why the hell do you think Pa never let us talk to girls in town?"
I looked at him in confusion.
"That thing in the chapel,"
he continued.
"it doesn't want outside competition. It gave birth to all of us, boys, but it can't control the gender of the baby it makes. Why do you think there's no girls in our family? What do you think happens when one is born?"
The beginnings of dread began to creep up from my stomach.
"Yours is coming today,"
Jamie continued. His mouth turned into a scowl. He let go of the vice grip on my arm.
"And for your sake, I hope it ain't a girl."
His face fell.
I wasn't so lucky.
Before I could say anything, he was gone, stalking off after the rest of our brothers. I stood staring after him. As night came, my dread grew. Gone was my pleasant mood from before. Night found me sleepless, and I stared at the ceiling for hours. When the door creaked open, I knew it was Pa. He came to my bedside and motioned for me to join him. We made our way through the dark woods to the chapel. The bad feeling was everywhere, soaked into the very air. The creatures of the night were silent, and it was cold. The chapel stood a white smear in the darkness. We went inside. The floorboards seemed to vibrate, and when Pa opened the trap door, I heard it. A terrible buzzing wail full of anger and pain, punctuated by inhuman squeaks and growls. I had heard the sound of animals in pain before. This was like some sort of horrible symphony of all of those cries. I recoiled at the sound, standing rooted to the spot. I looked at Pa to see if my horror was reflected in his face. It was, to some extent, but over it lay a veneer of hardness. I realized then that whatever was happening was no mystery to him. He had probably experienced it 100 times before. He took my arm and practically dragged me down the tunnel. The moths were flapping around wildly, diving at us and bouncing off the walls. A few of them flew into the candle flames, their feathery wings burning as fast as paper. The screaming got louder. We came to the chamber. The creature was in the same spot, but this time its body was rippling like a wave. Some of its arms were braced on the walls and floor. The sweet smell was gone, replaced by that of blood and viscera. The creature's puffy doll face was twisted in a horrifying mask of pain and rage. Spittle flew from its black mouth as it wailed, the sound bouncing around the chamber. Its antenna swiveled wildly around its head, every feather twitching and shaking. At the sight of us, its pallid face contorted further.
"Levi!"
It bellowed my father's name.
"What have you wrought? The fruit of your loins beget me only curses."
I was transfixed by the creature's rippling body, bile rising in the back of my throat. It was pushing something out, I realized. A dark puddle was forming on the floor beneath it. My father moved towards the creature like he meant to comfort it, and a pair of arms sideswiped him with surprising strength, sending him careening into the wall. He tripped over the candles. The creature let out a deep, throaty groan. Its body gave one more powerful ripple, and there was a wet noise as something dropped to the floor of the cave. What lay before me was essentially a cocoon. It was roughly watermelon-sized, white, and it glistened with fluid in the light. The creature's screams died into rattling breaths. As I watched, the cocoon began to tremble. A tiny red fist tore its way through the gauzy membrane. From the hole, I heard a cry, weak and plaintive. It was a baby. Something came over me. I somehow knew that this baby was mine. I'm sure others can tell better stories of parental instincts kicking in, but that's what happened to me at that moment. While my father and the creature struggled to recover, I knelt down and began ripping the cocoon apart, trying to free the baby within. The cocoon had the texture of spider silk, thin and sticky. It dissolved at my touch. Soon, the baby was free. Its skin was red and blotchy, and it looked like a lumpy potato. But its face and cry were wholly human, and as I held it in my hands, I could feel the very gears of the world turning. My fate was changing.
Elias,
the creature rasped. I looked up at it. Its expression had relaxed, its black eyes grown wide and shining, reflecting the candlelight. Its antennae had calmed, resuming their slow and gentle waving. It reached its nearest pair of arms out to me.
bring it to me,
it demanded. I lifted the baby in front of me and realized with sudden dread that something on it was missing. The baby was female. The creature's arms strained for the baby, and I instinctively clutched it to my chest. "Why?" I asked.
It is a usurper.
The creature spat.
It is a curse, and the labor was long. I am hungry.
It licked its lips, leaving behind a film of gray spit from a black tongue. Jamie's words came back to me then, and I realized that he was right. Pa had gotten to his feet. He clutched his side, clearly hurt, and his clothes were singed from candle flames.
Just give it to her, son.
He wheezed.
It'll be over soon.
I looked down at the baby. It was crying and squirming. It grabbed onto my shirt as tightly as it could, its little fist balling in the fabric. For the first time in my life, I made my own decision. I turned away from my family, and I ran. I held the baby tightly to my chest as I sprinted into the tunnel. My father called after me, but his voice was drowned out by a buzzing wail that grew in volume until it seemed a physical thing, a wave pushing me out. Moths bounced off my face. As I ran past the candles, they blew out, filling the tunnel with darkness. I thought I heard my father scream, a sound of terror beneath the creature's anger. I don't like to think about it. I left our property towards town, the baby still bawling loudly. Finally, I had to stop running, my lungs burning and my legs cramping. I had never been as afraid as I was limping through the dark forest, my daughter's cries a dead giveaway to any who would follow. But nothing did. I walked through the town, knocking on doors until someone answered. My daughter's sobs had tapered from a steady stream to quiet whimpers, and I knew she needed care soon. The ice cream girl answered the door, her hair mussed with sleep. She took in the sight of me, recognizing me immediately, and her eyes widened at the baby in my arms.
Please help us,
I croaked. It was the first time I'd spoken to a woman. Really spoken. Shirley's family took care of me for a while. They taught me how to care for my daughter, how to change diapers and prepare formula and burp her. I never left their house for fear of seeing my family. I was there for only a week or two. Then, my daughter and I hit the road again. We went from town to town, surviving on the kindness of strangers. It was usually women who ended up helping us. I met all kinds of women. Women hardened by the world. Bitter ones, gentle ones, fiery ones. They taught me about the world, about all the things I'd been missing. When we were far enough north that I felt safe, I began trying to settle down. My daughter was growing into a healthy, fat little toddler. She was the axis on which my world turned. Everything I did for her. Eventually, I named her Deborah. Debbie for short. I found a decent job with an on-site daycare for Debbie. Back then, it was a little easier to provide for a child than it is today, I won't deny. But I still worked myself to the bone. It was the easiest way to chase away the shadows that plagued my mind. I had lovers here and there, both men and women, but nothing lasted. Sex was difficult for me, considering what I had been through. I always felt disgusting afterwards, always unable to ignore the simple fact that it would never feel as good as that. And that knowledge made me feel like a monster. Eventually, I stopped trying to feign interest in sex. I was happier for it, but it meant that I never got into a real relationship. I didn't need a relationship. I had Debbie. And as the years passed and she grew bright and smart and funny, the shadows of my past seemed farther and farther away. But I was a fool to let myself be comforted by time. I cannot escape the curse of my blood, no matter how far I run. Yesterday was Debbie's 14th birthday. Today, she locked herself in the bathroom in the morning, crying for hours. When she finally let me in, I could barely contain a scream, because there, bursting from my daughter's forehead, was a pair of long, feathery antennae. "You're kidding me, right?" I asked, as Captain Malloy revealed just what exactly we were looking for. The crew gave each other strange looks and let out nervous chuckles. "Do I ever joke?" he asked back, with his usual stern look. He didn't. So the fact that he just claimed to know the location of the lost city of Atlantis could only mean two things. A, he'd lost his mind. And B, he legitimately knew the location of the supposedly mythological city. According to our captain, the city had been rediscovered after an underwater earthquake. How he was the one to come across this information, he wouldn't say. But he promised us all the riches we could ever dream of, as long as we followed him on the mission. "So what are we gonna do?" one of the men asked. "We're gonna dive down 7,000 feet and confirm what I found. One of my contacts will provide us with the tools we need. I trust a few of you know how to operate diving vessels." He was right. A good portion of the crew had scoured the depths of the ocean in miniature submarines, but most of us were fresh meat aboard the research vessel we'd since come to call home. Our job had never been more than tracking weather patterns and learning about how storms affected the ocean. While it wasn't the safest job, it beat the crushing pressure of the depths. "The submarine is only capable of holding 5 men, including myself and the helmsman. That leaves 3 spots for volunteers," Captain Malloy said. The men let out a few questioning mumbles, but none daring to speak up. I don't know if the captain was telling the truth, but I couldn't deny the unrelenting curiosity his insane statement had built up, so I raised my hand. "Ah, Winters. Good to have you on board. Are there any other brave souls ready to embark on a journey that might very well make it into the history books?" After another minute of nervous mumbling, 2 other men raised their hands. As fate would have it, the men were Quint and Brennan. 2 men of a silent nature. They were among the more experienced crewmen, mostly keeping to themselves. Excellent. We'll reach our destination within the next day. We'd already spent a week on the open ocean, albeit under the guise of another regular job. That night, we all gathered together in a small dining hall, whispering about what we would truly find at the bottom of the ocean. According to the legend, Atlantis was a city south of Gibraltar, one that had sunken into the ocean over 10,000 years ago. But we were heading far out into the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles away from its supposed location. Once the first light of day reflected off the waters on our port side, we had finally reached our destination. Just on the horizon, we could see the research vessel we were meeting up with. Due to the secretive nature of our mission, only a skeleton crew could be found aboard. But what it carried surprised me the most. A state-of-the-art submarine meant to traverse the deepest parts of the ocean, unlike anything ever built before. How they managed to procure such an instrument was a question better left unanswered. Few words were exchanged as we went aboard the unnamed research vessel. We were just shown the way to the submarine, where the 5 of us boarded what was essentially a metal prison. The helmsman's name was Dylan Wallace, the only crewman coming from the other ship. Unlike the rest of us, he didn't look suspicious, but rather excited about what might lie at the bottom of the ocean. Gentlemen, prepare for the last job you'll ever need to endure, Captain Malloy said as they shut the door on us. With that, we were lowered into the ocean. The windows were quickly enveloped with water, and the light of the rising sun was turned to mere rays dancing in the shallow depths of the ocean. Accompanying us downwards was little more than a few curious fish, quickly abandoning us as the waters darkened. We were making good speed, a fact only measured by the echo sounder. Truth be told, we might as well have been floating in an endless void, seeing as we didn't have a single landmark to guide our way. Despite our exceptionally strong lights, there was nothing to be seen. How long until we reach the bottom? I asked. About a half an hour, Wallace responded, his eyes still fixed on the equipment. I kept my face pressed against the window, trying to get some sense of our location. There were a few jellyfish and twisted deep-sea creatures out in the void, but apart from that, all I could see was darkness. The following 30 minutes felt like an eternity, and I felt as if I had to hold my breath until our helmsman finally announced that we should brace for impact. The landing was rough, but that was by design, as the vessel was built to resist pretty much any external force. I took another peek outside the window, only to find endless dunes of sand. There's nothing here? I said. We are some distance away from the actual target. Not sure how it happened. I suppose the current dragged us away. We kept moving along the ocean floor in search of ruins or any sign of ancient life. Before long, the soft sand gave way to rocky surface. There were massive, strange holes covering the majority of the surface, each measuring about a dozen feet in diameter and stretching endlessly far into the ground. What are those things? Quint asked, trying not to sound too worried. I haven't the faintest idea, Captain Malloy said back, but I don't think they're natural formations. Ignoring the weird phenomenon, we kept moving. In the distance, we could see a thick pillar that stood out from the ground. Is that? I began. It's Atlantis, Captain Malloy exclaimed in joy. I still couldn't believe it, but as we progressed further, the true magnitude of that pillar came into view. As we passed a cliff, we realized that it was the center of what once had been a massive city. Tons of ruins surrounded the thick structure, which stretched 100 feet up into the air. It shone gently as our light was reflected off it, and that's when we realized it was actually made from a strange-looking type of metal, almost untouched by time itself. I can't believe this, Wallace let out. The city, supposedly standing underwater for thousands of years, had yet to be washed away by the tides of time. Though the brick and stone was gone, the metal scaffold remained. At a first glance, none of us could figure out what the material really was, but the fact that nothing had broken it down, not even earthquakes, meant that it was the strongest building material known to man. Still, amongst the vast city, an eerie presence still lingered. The holes we'd seen on the rocky surface covered the city as well. "I wonder what made these holes," Quint said. As we descended down the cliffside into the city, we got a true scope of what had actually happened to Atlantis, because the cliff was riddled by exactly the same holes. Our assumptions were simple, that something had dug out the ground beneath the city until the point where the porous ground could no longer support the structures above, at which point it had sunken into the ocean, killing everyone living there. But above the tragedy stood a wonder hidden for thousands of years, a city extraordinarily well kept and built up by materials forgotten by mankind. Just a small sample of the material would make us rich beyond our wildest imaginations. We approached the ruins, ready to extract a small sample while taking enough pictures to shred any doubt back on the surface. "Wait, did you guys see that?" Brennan asked, as we tried to remove some of the metal. "See what?" the captain asked back. "There was something in the hole just a second ago," Brennan said. The rest of us gathered at the window, staring into the numerous holes below us, but they were empty. "There's nothing there," I said. "You sure you—" But before I could continue, our vessel shook violently. "What the fuck was that?" Quint asked. Our helmsman tried to maneuver the submarine away, but something appeared to have latched onto us. We peered out the window to see a gigantic earthworm-like creature emerge from one of the holes, faceless and covered in long, thin spikes. Each of its appendages appeared to be made from the same metal as the city itself. It approached us at a rapid pace, and once it had its body pressed up against the window, one of the spikes shot through the hole, stabbing Brennan through his chest. He let out a short whimper before falling lifeless as he hung on the spike penetrating the wall. The worm pulled away for a moment, appearing to detach the spike it had attacked us with. "Get us the hell out of here!" Quint yelled. Luckily, the spike seemed to seal the hole it had created, but our best luck was short-lived, as the worm struck again, shooting 3 more spikes through, one stabbing Quint through his leg and grazing the captain's arm. In addition, it had partially damaged the engines, making a quick ascent impossible. More worms emerged from the other holes, each one bigger than the last, far larger than our own vessel. As we reached the cliff, another one attacked us, that time hitting Quint through his abdomen and just barely missing his face. "Can't this thing go any faster?" I begged. "Half the engines are dead. This is all the speed we're gonna get," Wallace said in panic. We reached the top of the cliff just as another worm latched onto us. While the spikes just barely penetrated the hull, that one didn't let go. Instead, it clung to our metal box as we slowly ascended towards the surface, and on our tail we had a dozen more. They were all seemingly unaffected by the rapid pressure change, each just following, but not attacking. In a way, they almost seemed to be playing with us. By then, some of the spikes had been torn away, allowing water to pour into the submarine. Luckily, we were high enough up for the pressure not to instantly kill us, but the creature had still latched on. Quint had fallen unconscious from blood loss and was just barely breathing. We all knew he'd be dead long before we made it to shore, and if the creature didn't let go, so would we. But as we breached the surface, we were still partially enveloped by the massive worm. From the outside, we could hear gunshots, with some bullets hitting the creature and some hitting us. Luckily, the hull was strong enough to withstand it, which made the spikes even more menacing. The hail of bullets were just enough to make the creature let go of us. Without hesitation, we opened the hatch and climbed outside. The entire crew of both ships stood in panic on deck, watching about a dozen worms circle around. Some of them immediately pounced at the sight, shooting their spikes into the hull, penetrating it with ease. Wallace went back inside to try and get Quint loose, but just as he climbed back down, another worm attacked, shaking us to the ground. The crew on deck quickly lowered a rope, which I grabbed onto, following the captain. But as we did, the submarine was pulled back under with Wallace and Quint still inside, including all of the data we'd collected. By then, everyone back on board had realized it was a futile fight. Our accompanying research vessel had already started turning around, but with the creatures latched on, there was little we could do because the hull had been torn to shreds with water pouring in. At a record pace, it had already tipped over, with the crew desperately trying to get out of the water. One by one, they were consumed by the creatures, and we were next. "All of you get to the lifeboats now!" the captain ordered as he turned to enter the engine room. "What are you gonna do?" I asked. "I'm making sure these things don't follow us back." With that, he ran towards the engines as the rest of us attempted to use the lifeboats to flee. As we lowered the boats into the ocean, we were picked off one by one by the worms below. In the end, we were hanging on the side of the ship, trying our best to not get consumed by the monstrosities we ourselves had awoken. Then we heard a brief bang, followed by a flame that started engulfing the entire ship. The captain had ignited the fuel reserves. Before we could react, the ship exploded, propelling us all into the infested waters below. The last thing I remember before the world faded to darkness was grabbing onto a piece of debris. Then nothing. I can't tell how much time passed, but when I woke up, both ships had long been taken down into the depths of Atlantis. There were no survivors, only myself floating on an endless ocean on a piece of debris. 3 days would pass until I coincidentally drifted into a shipping lane, but when I told them my story, no one believed a word. Atlantis was a real place, full of hidden discoveries never to be seen again. And if I'm perfectly honest, it's just better that way. Those creatures, whatever they are, need to be left alone until the end of time itself. We have this urban legend in my city called the Wrong Way Man. Supposedly, you might see him standing on the side of the road when you're driving. Some say it's always when you're on your way home. I've seen pictures of the Wrong Way Man. They circulate among us by text message. They circulate among students, workers, friends, and family here. Oddly, I'd never seen any of those pictures posted online. I'm not sure if it's because of fear, because those who have taken the pictures want to perpetuate the mystique of our local urban legend, or because of something else. I was pretty sure that those pictures had been a hoax, just someone dressed up as the Wrong Way Man. Maybe it was the same person every time. As far as what the Wrong Way Man looks like, he wears his tattered clothing backwards, usually a flannel shirt and jeans. His painted smiling face looks eerily realistic until he turns to the side and you could see it's a smooth surface. It seems that he shaves his hair off, paints a face over the back of his head, and puts a shoulder-length wig on that covers up his real face. Those who I've met who have claimed to have spotted the Wrong Way Man say they waited a week before driving home, staying over at a friend's house or a hotel and not even bothering to go home to pack a suitcase. I've also heard, though, that you need to wait a month. The common consensus seems to be if you see him while driving home, don't finish your drive home. Turn around and go somewhere else, and wait for at least a week. I personally thought it was a bunch of nonsense, until my date and I saw the Wrong Way Man when we were going back to my house from the movies. It was Katie who spotted him. "Slow down," she said. "I think I see the Wrong Way Man you told me about." Katie had only lived in my city for half a year, so one of the things I had told her on my quest to share with her as many interesting things as I could had been our local urban legend about the Wrong Way Man. I'd never seen someone dressed as the Wrong Way Man in person. Pictures, sure, but never in person. My foot was shaking as I eased up on the gas. It was dark, nearing midnight dark, and there were either no streetlights or they were off. My car's headlights lit him up. On the side of the road, he was facing us. Actually, he had his back to us. That painted face was facing us. The jeans and flannel shirt and wig were all turned our way as well. His arms and legs looked wrong. They were shoved down in his clothing the opposite way. I wanted to be amused, but I was alarmed. When we got to be about 10 feet away in my car, he turned his painted head towards us. Those painted eyes, realistic but forever held too wide, seemed to be staring right into mine. As we drove slowly by, I waved to him and laughed to try and ease some of the tension. He didn't wave back. I looked at Katie, and she was waving too, but she wasn't laughing. I glanced back in time to see the slick side of that person's shaved, painted head, and the optical illusion of a real face being there was shattered, but somehow worse for it. Also, when I peered into the rearview mirror as we increased our distance, I thought I saw something glinting beneath the shoulder-length wig he wore. Then, he was gone, lost to the darkness. I picked up speed. He hadn't been walking, but somehow I was worried he would come after us too quickly.
"So what do we do now?"
Katie said.
"We can't go to your home or mine."
I glanced at her, and soon we both started laughing. "Well," I said, "after tonight we'll be able to tell everyone around that we saw the wrong way man and went immediately home."
"I wonder who was pretending to be the wrong way man," Katie said. "I wonder why they were doing it. Do you think we should turn back around and try and talk to him?"
"I'd rather we didn't," I said. "They could be dangerous, but I'm sure it's just someone looking to keep the urban legend alive."
"It's your car,"
Katie said.
"But if it was mine..."
"All right," I said. "We'll turn back around. My grandpa used to say if you're in doubt which turn to make, you can always take a U-turn until you figure things out. He used that as a metaphor for life. But as I did my U-turn, my heart was thrashing in my chest. We drove down the entirety of that dark street without seeing that person again. It was a couple of miles long in that direction, so there's no way they could have walked or run the distance so quickly. Katie and I decided that the person dressed as the wrong way man must have left the shoulder of the road for the surrounding woods. The idea of them hiding in the woods as we drove by again made me feel like I had spiders crawling over my flesh. We did another U-turn, and during the whole time I kept glancing around in case that person jumped at us from out of nowhere. But soon we were headed back in the direction of my house with no second look at the wrong way man. Katie and I tried to laugh it out, and we tried talking about other things, but both of us were pretty scared. We couldn't stop chatting about everything and nothing, or glancing out the windows or into our side mirrors. We turned into my subdivision, then we turned onto my street, and everything changed. As soon as we turned onto my street, we started to go backwards instead of forwards.
"Did you put it in reverse?"
Katie said. Her hand was gripping my arm. It was cold as ice. I stopped the car. Both of us were looking down. The car was in drive. I took my foot off the brake and put it onto the gas pedal again. The houses, familiar houses I saw every day when coming home, were moving away from us. "Maybe something's wrong with my car," I said. But when I tried driving forward again, I looked to the side, and then in the rearview mirror, we were not moving. Not according to those views. In front of us, the houses receded every time I put my foot on the gas, but from the side and rear, it appeared that we were standing still. On my street, everything was well lit. There were tons of street lights, so we couldn't argue it away as if it had anything to do with limited visibility.
"Let's get out of here,"
Katie said. Her voice was almost a whisper. "Yeah," I said, in a similar way. "But how are we gonna leave?"
"Put it in reverse."
When I put my car in reverse and tried that, we actually moved forward. But to the side and rear, once again, we seemed to have not moved, like we were caught just past the entrance to my neighborhood. It was when Katie and I had stopped the car and were debating getting out that we spotted someone coming towards us on the sidewalk. They were approaching us from the front of the vehicle, so I'm not sure how accurate the distance was. It seemed like they were already about 20 feet away. I don't know why it took me so long to realize this. Maybe it was because I didn't want to, but I recognized my neighbor by the back of his head and by his body shape, which was somewhat atypical. I'd seen him often stooped working in his garden while I was driving by. He was walking backwards towards us. When he got closer, he stopped. Then he began shouting, "Emple, Emple," over and over again, standing stock still, his back to us. Only later would I realize he had been saying "help me" in reverse. I rolled down the window. "Mr. Nelson?" I said. "What's the matter?" He stopped shouting. Now that my window was down, I could hear his body creak and snap. Blood poured out of fissures as the joints of his arms and legs changed drastically. When Mr. Nelson's head twisted all the way around towards us, I was sure that I saw the lights go out of his eyes. Then, whatever had taken over Mr. Nelson made a first step forward with the new architecture of his body. Katie and I both began to scream at that first step. I rolled up the window as Mr. Nelson loped around on strange, inhuman legs. His kneecaps and elbows had become stretched and exaggerated from being reversed. I put my foot on the gas with the car still in reverse, and through the front windows we seemed to be careening forward. Even though a glance out the sides or in the rearview mirrors showed us to still be stationary, we slammed into Mr. Nelson. Blood slashed across the windshield. The car rose and fell as we went over his body. To the sides and rear, there was no indication of the car rising and falling. I didn't see a lump appear behind us either. I kept my foot on the gas, still going forward in reverse. I saw a window of a neighbor's house shatter. A couple I barely recognized crawled out like baby spiders out of eggs, leaking blood and more blood as they scraped themselves against the shards in the window frame. When the wife paused in the window, she smiled. She intentionally rubbed her scalp against a particularly sharp-looking piece of glass. Meat and blood came away. I think I could see the white of her skull. By then, her husband was already on the ground, running towards us. I sped forward. They and their houses vanished in the sides and rear of the vehicle, which were, again, still stuck near the street's entrance. More people were coming out of their homes. They came out all twisted and broken, damaging themselves further as they exited. They ran towards us on backwards legs, churning their backwards arms. Everything about them was the wrong way. Before long, I found myself slamming on the brakes. "What are you doing? Keep going!" Katie yelled. "They're gonna catch up with us!" Ahead, I saw my own driveway. Someone that looked like me was talking to another person with a painted face. The painted face nodded. Up and down, it nodded like a real face would do. Then, when I saw the wig shuffle and move seemingly on its own, I realized that the true face under the wig was talking, moving its lips, breathing. The wrong way man was talking to me, or someone who looked like me. At the same time, Katie was reaching over me, trying desperately to put her foot on the gas. A couple of twisted pieces of bone and meat collided with the windshield. Two faces with bunched up folds of neck leered at me out of glazed eyes. These were faces I should have recognized. Their twisted arms continued to beat at the window, even though their eyes told me that no one was home. A spider's web of cracks spread across the windshield, and its grooves caught blood. I slammed my foot on the gas while helping to steady Katie back into her seat. We flung those two off, and right after we ran over an entire family in quick succession. I didn't have time to feel guilty. Those were not my neighbors. They were not my neighbors. These were not. Katie and I both began to change. I heard some of my bones break. I felt it a moment later, like the reverse of lightning before thunder. Katie and I started screaming, almost in unison and about in the same tune. It was like a choir of pain and fear and pain had risen up with us as instruments. "Keep your head back!" I yelled, as I strove to keep my head pinned against my seat.
Don't let it twist around! No matter what happens to the rest of our bodies, we can't let it kill us! I know!
Katie said.
Just get this car out of here! Make a U-turn or something!
Still in reverse, yet still going forward, I wheeled the car, screeching around. I didn't glance out the sides or rear. I just gunned it, heading back towards where we had come from. The wrong way man waited. He waited for me at the juncture of my driveway and the street. His painted mouth grinned forever. His painted eyes were too wide and incapable of blinking. We passed him and drove out of the neighborhood. Katie and I weren't out of the woods, though. I was able to get us to a nearby gas station before my legs and arms, which were partway reversed and leaking blood, completely gave out. We crawled out of the vehicle and onto the cold, hard concrete at the gas station. I blacked out almost immediately, but Katie tells me she retained consciousness until the ambulance arrived. I don't envy her. We spent months in the hospital with broken bones and torn ligaments and muscle. I think the only thing that had saved us permanent damage might have been the seats of our vehicle resisting our changes. We told the doctors we had been in a car accident. They shook their heads at us and kept asking questions. I did go back home eventually. We both did. The reason I went home was because one of my neighbors that we had run over with my car came to the hospital to visit me. They seemed completely fine, as if nothing had happened and the wrong way man had never changed them. But damage was done to my vehicle and to Katie and me, both physically and psychologically. And while our bodies are on the mend, I don't think we'll ever be the same. I feel the wrong way inside. I work for NASA as an astronomer, and there are certain things that we keep hidden from the public. No, the Earth isn't flat, and aliens don't control the government. Fuck, I wish those were the case, as the truth is much, much worse. In 1993, the Hubble Space Telescope saw a star disappear. It didn't go supernova or die naturally. It simply went dark over the span of a few minutes. The star was already too faint to see with the naked eye, and ground-based telescopes had trouble picking it out from among the surrounding stars, so the event wasn't widely known to the public. At the time, we thought the most likely explanation was that a cloud of interstellar dust had drifted between Earth and the star, occluding it from view. It was noted and mostly forgotten about. In 2007, 2 more stars vanished. Due to the circumstances of this event, this was much more concerning. The 2 stars in question were part of a binary system, orbiting each other at a fairly close distance. If a cloud of interstellar dust was the culprit again, they would have both seemed to disappear simultaneously, or very close to it. Instead, both stars faded individually over a period of minutes, separated by a span of about 8 hours. This binary system was also about 15 light-years closer to Earth than the star that had previously disappeared in 1993. After carefully reviewing millions of Hubble images, 2 more stars were identified which had gone out in the years 1995 and 2002. These were all in the same stellar neighborhood, only a handful of light-years from each other. The only conclusion we could draw was that some unknown influence, traveling close to the speed of light, was shrouding or destroying these stars. Unfortunately, the Hubble wasn't sensitive enough to tell us any more than that. The James Webb Space Telescope first came online a few months ago. Although official channels will tell you that it's still undergoing testing, we've been actively collecting data since early February. One of the first things we did was to aim the telescope at the regions of space occupied by the vanished stars. If they were being blocked by dust clouds, a hope that some of us still held on to, the increased sensitivity of the JWST may have been able to see through them and confirm that the stars were still there. Unfortunately, we had no such luck. The first 3 stars that had disappeared were still completely dark, Gravitational wave detectors, though, soon found something odd. In all cases, not only were the stellar masses still present, but the amount of mass had actually increased. More sensitive observations had also detected a type of string or web stretching through space connecting these now invisible stars. When we trained the telescope on the binary system that had vanished in 2007, which was the nearest point at which the phenomenon had so far been observed, there was finally enough ambient EM spectrum radiation left to try a mass spectrometer reading. If you're not aware, mass spectrometry is an incredibly useful process, whereby measuring the patterns of light, wavelengths emitted or reflected by an object, we can learn tons of useful information, such as its temperature, speed, and direction of movement, and chemical composition. The readings we got from the binary stars didn't make any sense, though. First of all, they were cold, almost as cold as the surrounding interstellar medium. Whatever had happened to these stars had snuffed them out completely, or something prevented their light from escaping. What was truly puzzling, however, were the emission lines returned by the mass spectrometer. Several familiar elements such as hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and magnesium were identified, but these were few and far between. Most of the readings didn't correspond to any known chemical elements, and even seemed to defy what we knew about the physics of light, matter, and chemistry. This massive star-spanning structure was primarily composed of materials that we didn't even have names for, and may not even have been matter as we understand it. Speculation ran rampant. Obviously, such a thing couldn't be a natural phenomenon. Finally, we had proof of extraterrestrial life. But what was this thing we had discovered, and for what purpose was it being built? The leading hypothesis was that we were looking at a series of Dyson shells, massive solar collectors built to completely envelop stars in order to capture 100% of their energy output. Such a concept had been envisioned in the early 20th century as a potential source of energy for an interstellar civilization. Ever since then, the idea had found its way into popular science fiction. The construction of these massive structures had actually been theorized to be one of the first signs of intelligent extraterrestrial life that we may someday detect. It seemed that that day was today. The theory still didn't explain everything, though. First of all, there was the impossible speed which the stars were covered. Constructing a Dyson shell from scratch in a matter of minutes was beyond even the wildest speculations of scientists and sci-fi writers. Then, there were the mysterious filaments that connected the shells over distances of light years. No one had any idea what purpose these could serve, or how they could even be built. Everyone at NASA was fascinated by this mystery. In hindsight, we may have been better off if we had never discovered the truth. Less than a month ago, the JWST detected a series of unusual energy bursts emanating from interstellar space. These were occurring at the very edge of a star system approximately 12 light-years from the binary system that vanished in 2007. As we focused the telescope on this system, we soon determined that these were not natural phenomena either. The energy signatures, which were still flashing intermittently, matched what would be expected from thermonuclear and antimatter-based explosions, along with several other types of energies that we couldn't identify. These explosions, although still not visible to the naked eye on Earth from that distance, were absolutely tremendous in magnitude, easily billions of times more powerful than any nuke that humanity could conceivably build. After experimenting with the telescope's settings, we were able to get a clearer picture of what was going on. The tip of one of the interstellar filaments that linked the Dyson system was passing through the Oort cloud of the distant star system, approaching its sun, and whoever lived there was fighting back. Their weapons were able to slow the thing's advance, shattering, breaking off, and vaporizing planet-sized chunks of the object, but it seemed to be rebuilding itself almost as fast as it was being destroyed. After less than a week, the explosion stopped. It seemed that they had run out of ammunition. In the void between stars, we knew that these things traveled at nearly the speed of light, but as we watched it approach the inner star system, its pace slowed as it swelled in size, preparing to devour the system's star. We quickly trained the telescope's mirrors on the doomed sun. We were about to watch whatever this thing was blot out another star, but in real time. We all held our breath as we watched the projected image of the main sequence star, slightly larger than our own sun. At first, nothing seemed to be happening, but soon a small shadow appeared on the edge of the luminous orb, soon followed by another shadow, and then a third. The shadows began to converge, forming a strange yet somehow familiar pattern as they blocked out the star's light.
"What are those?"
One of my colleagues gasped.
"They almost look like..."
She paused, as if afraid to say the next word for fear of ridicule. I, however, had no such hesitancy. "Leaves," I said, my voice monotone. The situation was far too incredible to express any emotional reaction, even that of pure shock. "They look like leaves." We watched as over a period of minutes, a web of shadowy outlines, matching the familiar shapes of oblong leaves and thin vines, proceeded to blot out the remaining light from the distant star. By that point, everyone in the room had realized the truth. The phenomenon that we've been tracking for so many years wasn't some hyper-advanced alien megastructure. Hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and magnesium, some of the few familiar elements we had detected. They were all components of chlorophyll. It was a plant, an enormous plant that spanned across light years. And, much like terrestrial plants, it sought out light to fuel itself. The filaments connecting the stars across interstellar space were stem branches. It would grow in the direction of the nearest stars it sensed, completely enveloping them, and then moving on. Any life inhabiting planets orbiting those stars would be left to freeze to death, or perhaps even worse. It was possible that the plant would devour those plants to add to its mass as well. Everyone was silent as the telescope continued to gather data. Eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, a young astronomer spoke up from the far end of the room, addressing our supervisor. "Sir, we've begun to detect the formation of another tendril leaving the system. Its vector is..." He gulped. He didn't need to say any more, but he did anyway. "It's heading directly for our sun." "How much time do we have?" The supervisor replied grimly. "Judging by the time lag, distance, relativistic properties, and previously observed speeds of this thing, I'd estimate no more than 27 years, sir." 27 years. We had just watched this galactic weed overwhelm a civilization that was, at the very least, thousands of years ahead of us technologically, and we had less than 3 decades. I'll probably be found and silenced for posting this, but I don't care. I have to tell someone. I can't keep this a secret any longer. When the sun turns black and the world begins to freeze, at least you'll have some idea of what's going on. Small comfort, it may be. Hi, my name is Willie, and I'm about to tell you a story that is so scary and yet true at the same time that you wouldn't believe me after hearing this. But what do I have to lose? Oh well, here it goes. I don't normally enjoy Halloween. Why, you ask? It's because it reminds me of my breakup with my ex-psychopathic girlfriend, Nikinja. Every time Halloween comes around, I do nothing but sit around in my game chair and play Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2. Each time, kids will come and ring on my doorbell. I'll just ignore them and turn off my lights and pretend I'm not even home. I received a notification from the Tinder app, which I totally forgot that I had the app installed on my phone in the first place. Looks like I have a new match, I said, while looking at my phone. I immediately opened the Tinder app, and to my surprise, I was correct. I was matched with the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. Her name was Esmeralda, and everything about her was perfect. She even played Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2 as well. And she also stayed in the same town I lived in, which is Memphis, Tennessee, by the way. She immediately texted me and said, "Hi, my name is Esmeralda and I would like to get to know you since we're gaming buddies and all, LOL. I replied back with, "LOL, you seem pretty cute yourself. How about we meet somewhere for dinner? My treat." She responded back saying, "Sure, meet me at Red Lobster in 5 minutes." I ended the conversation off with, "Okay, I'll be there," and I immediately got up and got dressed. As I grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter, I pet my dog Milo one last time before placing him in his kennel. I got in my car and drove off. When I arrived at Red Lobster, to my amazement, there she was. She was sitting at the table waiting for me. She had long black hair with a smoking hot body and a gorgeous red dress. In my head, I thought to myself, "Willie, you are one lucky man." I approached the table and I was immediately welcomed by a graceful hug from her. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Willie," she said. "Wait a minute. How do you know my name? I never told you anything about me," I said inquisitively. "Your Tinder profile, silly," she replied, while giggling softly. I shrugged my shoulder and brushed it off, and we began our date. Everything started out relatively normal, but I was mostly hypnotized by her beauty that I really couldn't stay focused on the menu that was on the table. She was even prettier in person, and I couldn't believe how well the conversation was flowing. However, it didn't take long for me to realize she was a super private person. For example, she would not tell me her last name, where she worked, or anything else about her family. She made it clear that she was protecting herself, and honestly, I don't blame her. She took great interest in the fact that I was in seminary study to be a pastor, but to be honest, I'm not really into that kind of stuff. I'm just an ordinary gamer who's trying to become famous one day, I said to her. She responded with a smile, saying, "Oh, I see. Well, keep that up and you might just have your wish granted." In my head, I thought to myself, this is nice, because usually that's a deal breaker for most women, at least in my experience. Towards the end of our meal, she confessed something to me. "I have something to tell you," she said, "but please don't think I'm crazy." I braced myself for whatever she was about to say. She explained that she recently moved into a new apartment. She lived alone, which was also a new thing. Though she couldn't put her finger on it, she was convinced that there was a presence of a sinister paranormal nature in her apartment. She had hardly slept since she moved in because she was plagued with constant nightmares and strange occurrences. I could see the fear and exhaustion in her eyes. She seemed quite sincere. "I can tell you're a good guy," she said. She elaborated that I seemed trustworthy and had a calming presence. "I know how this sounds, but would you please come home with me tonight? Honestly, I'm just scared to go back there alone. I'm not looking for, well, you know what." I was really taken aback by this. It's not every day I get asked to spend the night with a beautiful woman who I just met. I figured she was either telling the truth or she picked a really odd way to initiate sex. Either way, the night would be interesting. We talked for a bit longer and I agreed to spend the night with her. I followed her home, and when I walked into her apartment, I was immediately struck with bad vibes. There was just something ominous about that place. I didn't want to freak her out, so I kept these feelings to myself. I said a quick prayer and followed her to the bedroom. She wasn't kidding about the sex, by the way. I tried my luck, but was met with swift rejection. We kissed and cuddled for a bit, but nothing too crazy, and then she fell asleep. I just laid there for a while in the silent darkness, lost in thought. Sometime later, it sounded like I heard someone walking down the hallway outside the bedroom. The door was closed, however, so I couldn't see anything. I was definitely frightened, but my curiosity got the better of me, so I went to investigate. Slowly, I opened the door. I looked to my left, then to my right. Nothing. I walked downstairs to check out the rest of the apartment. Nothing. I went back upstairs to check the bathroom and the guest bedroom. Nothing. When I walked down to the guest room, which was right across from Esmeralda's bedroom, I looked to my left and right again. At the end of the hallway, I saw a black humanoid body standing there, perfectly still. "What the fuck?" I said, while continuing to stare at it. Normally, I would pack my stuff up and say fuck this shit and leave, but I didn't want to leave Esmeralda. It was almost like a shadow, but I could discern that it was a three-dimensional figure. This figure was large in stature. There's no way it could have been Esmeralda. She was maybe 5'1" at best. I ran towards the figure with a bat in my hand that I grabbed out of my car before I came inside the apartment. The figure then screamed at me with a high-pitched demonic scream that was so loud that it made my ears bleed. "Ah!" I screamed, while holding my ears in pain. The figure then spoke to me and said, "You are not going anywhere. You're stuck here forever. There is no escape." I used the bat to lift myself from the ground and responded back in anger, saying, "Like hell I am! There's no way in hell I'm staying here! Fuck this!" I swung my bat at the figure's head and it began screaming in a painful, demonic way. "This is my chance," I said, while running back to Esmeralda's room. To my horror, she wasn't in bed where I left her. I called out her name. "Esmeralda! Esmeralda, where are you?" But there was no response. I had just walked through the entire apartment, so it literally made no sense to me that she wasn't there. The bed was low to the ground, so she couldn't be under it. The closet was open too, and it was packed with boxes, so I knew she wasn't there either. The window was shut tight, plus it was the second story. It was as if she had vanished. I grabbed my wallet, keys, and cell phone and ran out of the apartment in nothing but my underwear. The shadowy figure was gone, and I jumped in my car and sped away. I never heard from her again. Her Tinder profile was deleted the next day, and she never responded to any of my texts. To this day, I still have no idea what the fuck happened that night. I also never went back to her apartment, mostly because I'm horrible with directions, and I don't want to encounter that demonic figure again. Needless to say, this was easily one of the most terrifying, inexplicable things I've ever experienced. My name is Joshua. I'm an infantryman with a private military outfit I cannot name. We are currently deployed on a security detail in a war-torn corner of Africa. Our mission has gone horribly, horribly wrong, and I don't think we're fighting insurgents or terrorists anymore. Our entire force will be moving out soon. I'm not sure we will be coming back. Whatever we've come across here, it's not natural. It's not of this earth. And it wants us all dead. I was part of the team that found it a week ago. It was supposed to be just a routine patrol. Our objective was to make sure that there was no enemy movement in the vicinity of our base, and no threat to the one local settlement in the area. It was a hot, dry day. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the scrub-covered plains that we moved through gave no protection against the elements, not even a single tree to throw a little shade. I was sweating horribly, my head lowered to shield my eyes against the glare of the sun. Because of this, I barely managed to stop in time to avoid colliding with Harris, my squad mate. He had been in position in front of me, but had stopped without warning. "What's going on, man?" I asked, walking around him. "What's the holdup?" Harris was motionless, his face screwed up in confusion. "There's something wrong with my radio," he answered at last. I leaned in closer and immediately heard what he meant. His radio was giving off strange squawking sounds mixed with a high-pitched buzzing. "What's the delay?" came a yell from up ahead. Our superior, Sergeant Wright. I cursed inwardly. Wright was a hard son of a bitch, and I didn't want him thinking we were slacking. "Equipment malfunction, sir," I answered quickly. "Radio's acting up." Sergeant Wright walked over to us. The rest of the patrol, some 5 men, cast annoyed glances at us. Every minute we spent out here in the heat was torture, and to them, me and Harris were only prolonging their suffering. "What's wrong with it?" asked Wright. "Some kind of interference, sir," answered Harris, experimenting with the various switches on the receiver.
I don't know if...
The whole patrol cursed and covered their ears as every single radio suddenly erupted in a deafening chorus of shrill squawks and whistles. After several seconds, the deluge of sound stopped just as suddenly as it had began.
Ah! What the hell was that?
I asked, my ears ringing. Sergeant Wright didn't answer, instead activating his own radio. "Command, can you read me? Over," he said, testing the connection. There were a few seconds of silence, then the receiver chirruped to life.
"This is Command. Over."
"We have an equipment malfunction here. Some sort of radio interference. Anything of that sort at base? Over."
"Something just happened to us as well, Sergeant. All of our systems went haywire for several seconds, then straight back to normal. Continue your patrol, but be careful. Report any activity immediately. Over."
The line went dead. Sergeant Wright brandished his rifle. "You heard the order, men. Move out. Eyes sharp." We set out again. The sun still beat down, but we were no longer lethargic from the heat. Adrenaline had purged that weakness from our minds. All eyes were up, scanning our surroundings intently. After half an hour of walking, we spotted something in the distance, a strange bump in the terrain. Harris brought his binoculars up, scanning it intently. "What is it, Harris?" I asked. "I thought it was all plains out here." "It is," he said, lowering the binoculars. "Or at least, it was supposed to be. There's some sort of low hillock there, though." We pushed on, cautious and alert. Eventually, we reached the strange bump. It wasn't high, only a few meters tall, but it was wide, stretching out far on both sides of us. We climbed to its top and stopped in awe. Before us was a massive chasm, a circular hole in the ground almost 200 feet across. Peering down, all I could see was darkness, the bottom nowhere in sight. A cold, clear draft hit me in the face. "What is this?" mumbled one of the soldiers. This isn't supposed to exist." Sergeant Wright unslung his pack, hauling out a large field map. He unfolded it and scanned across it, locating our position, his face screwed up in confusion. "Whatever this is, it isn't on our map," he said at last. "You're right. It isn't supposed to be here at all."
Sergeant, look,
said Harris. His voice had suddenly become very small and quiet. His eyes were distant. I followed his gaze. The sky was full of birds. Where they'd come from so quickly I didn't know. The flocks wheeled and swelled in strange patterns, like nothing I'd ever seen. As I watched, one bird suddenly stopped flapping its wings and streaked down. This was no controlled, graceful dive. It felt like a stone cartwheeling and spinning uncontrollably, cawing and shrieking. It plummeted into the darkness of the pit and was gone. Another followed, then another. More joined in. In less than a minute, the air in front of us was filled with falling bodies, all stone still as they fell down into the darkness of the chasm.
They're killing themselves.
Whispered one of the soldiers.
They're fucking killing themselves, man.
We returned straight to base. Sergeant Wright immediately reported the chasm, of course. The confusion only grew after that. Not only was the hole not on our maps, it also didn't appear on any of the satellite images of the area, and no previous patrol had noticed it. It was as if it had just appeared out of thin air. In the several seconds, all our electronics went down. Theories flared up like fire. Was it an insurgent base? Had they hidden it somehow? It seemed like the most logical explanation, far-fetched as it was. The chasm quickly became known as 225199, after its grid coordinates. By the time Wright finished his report to command, night was quickly approaching, and there was little time to formulate a response. As the sun fell, staining the plains orange and red, 2 troop carriers departed our base. 20 men were dispatched to guard 225199 until the next morning. On top of that, it was surrounded by motion-activated tripwires. If anything moved around it, we would know. I spent the evening discussing our findings with Harris in our tent. He was just as dumbfounded by the situation as I was.
How the hell could someone keep a place like that secret?
He asked me, disassembled rifle in his lap.
Where would the locals get that kind of technology?
I don't know, man, I answered, idly lighting a cigarette. Whatever it is, we'll find out tomorrow. Someone will probably get sent down there to recon, and then we'll know. What about those birds? That was weird as hell. Harris shrugged his shoulders.
Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe there's some vapors coming out of it that paralyze or confuse them.
I guess, I answered warily.
Anyway,
continued Harris,
at least something interesting is happening. It's been too long since...
The flap to our tent flew open, and we jumped to attention as Sergeant Wright swept in.
Sergeant, what's... Get your gear on now, soldiers. We're moving out. Move!
He turned on his heel, running out of the tent immediately. We both sprung into action, putting on our equipment and shouldering readied packs. As we ran into the night, we were immediately surrounded by bustling, anxious activity. The whole base was on its feet. Men and women running around, preparing equipment and vehicles.
What's happening?
I yelled at Harris.
I don't know, man, but I don't like it.
We quickly joined the rest of our unit, the last to do so. Sergeant Wright gave us a withering look before clearing his throat and addressing the whole squad.
12 minutes ago, the proximity sensors around 225199 went off. All of them, around the entire circumference at the same time. The unit dispatched to guard it reported movement before the radios went dead.
Wright was silent for several seconds, and in the dark I was almost certain he was trembling. What did the sergeant hear in his briefing that could make him react like this?
Our orders are to move in, secure the location, and find our missing comrades. Be on high alert. We're not sure what we're dealing with out there.
Our unit was ushered onto the bed of a truck, and we quickly drove out into the night. We weren't the only ones. Our vehicle was only one of dozens. Hundreds of men were being mobilized. It took little time to reach 225199. As the truck rolled to a halt, we jumped off its bed, weapons held high, panning the night. The hillocks surrounding the abyss loomed above us in the darkness. We moved out, our progress slowed by both low visibility and our own wariness. Every shadow, every swaying scrub hedge seemed to be hiding the movement of an enemy. Something pale in front of me caught my eye. My weapon came up, and I mumbled into the radio.
I have something.
I approached the thing slowly. At first, I couldn't make out any details, but as I moved forward, the shape resolved. A man lying on the ground. He was naked, stripped of all clothes and equipment. He wasn't moving. I rushed forward to him.
I need a medic at my location immediately,
I cried into the radio, my heart hammering. Behind, I could hear footsteps as the rest of my unit closed in, covering me. I knelt down at the prone figure. Still, he didn't move. The man was lying face down, and I reached under him to roll him over. As I shifted his body, my heart plummeted. It was cold. Too cold. No living being could ever be this cold.
Command, I have a...
My voice trailed off. The way the body had moved as I turned it over, the way it felt, it had been strange. I couldn't place my finger on why. With a rush of disgust and horror, I realized why. The body was horribly soft, pliant, the limbs bending at grotesque angles as if made of rubber. The body had no bones. I bent over and retched onto the ground. A hand gripped my shoulder, and the face of Sergeant Wright appeared next to me. Figures came out of the dark, medics and soldiers.
Come with me, Private,
said Wright quietly, putting his arm around my shoulders.
There's nothing you can do here.
I don't...
I began, but a fresh bout of nausea silenced my objections. Many strong arms grabbed me and led me away. I don't remember the journey back to the base. Harris told me that only a few trucks returned. Most of the soldiers stayed behind, scouring the land for the rest of the missing unit. They never found them. In the morning, Sergeant Wright informed me that I was to stay on base that day. The rest of my unit would be going to the local village to ask them for potential information on the attackers from last night. I didn't complain. The horrible memory of that morbidly soft, pliant body had seared itself into my mind. I needed time to recover. But as the day wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about the previous night and the corpse I'd found. What could possibly do something like that to a man? How could his bones be removed from his body? I had seen no obvious injury that might have explained such a hideous disfigurement. Had I simply missed it in the dark? My morbid thinking was finally interrupted as my unit returned. I could immediately see that something was wrong. Where usually they would be playfully taunting each other or discussing the situation on base, they were quiet and brooding. Harris sat down on his cot opposite me. He was pale, his eyes darting and furtive. "Harris, what's wrong?" I asked, confused.
It's nothing, Josh.
He answered quietly. "Did something happen in the village? Are the locals all right?"
They're fine. They didn't tell us what happened at 225199.
"Then what's wrong? Why is everyone acting like this?" Harris looked up at me, his eyes filled with an uncertain, unknowable terror. A chill ran down my back.
They know something, man. They wouldn't tell us, even when Wright lost his temper and threatened them. Kept saying they didn't do it.
"Then what?"
That's not all they said, Josh. We talked to the young ones first, of course. You know how the locals are. The older they are, the more they hate us. No one wanted to talk to us. They just looked down and said they didn't know anything. We were about to leave, but then some old crone started shouting. She had kept silent all this time, but she finally opened up.
"What did she say?" I asked. Without realizing it, I had dropped my voice to a whisper.
She said that her people were innocent, that something else had taken our men. She called it something strange, older than light. She warned that we should forget about them and pray that we won't be next.
This was 5 days ago. Today, we finally received orders. The entire base is moving out. The decision was made way up the chain of command. Someone in charge seems to think that the chasm is home to a terrorist cell, and we were being sent to flush them out. I don't think any one of us here actually believes that. The people giving the orders haven't seen what we've seen. We surrounded the chasm from all sides, our advance covered by armored vehicles and hovering helicopters with weapons trained on the abyss. Military engineers moved in. They've constructed a massive pulley system that'll lower dozens of men at a time into the darkness on a huge platform. An hour ago, we were supposed to begin descending. All units were standing ready, awaiting their turn. The mood was grim. Harris held a well-worn crucifix in his fist and mumbled prayers. The air around us thrummed with the spinning rotors of attack helicopters. They were once again covering the abyss, all weapons readied. From up there, they had a commanding view of the area and could even peer down into the darkness. I didn't see the moment things went to shit. Harris suddenly cursed, pointing upwards at the sky, his face pale.
What the fuck? What the fuck?
High above us, the hovering helicopters swayed madly, as if their pilots were intoxicated. The sergeants were screaming into their radios, requesting information, orders, anything. Suddenly, the aircraft lurched forward, drawn like marionettes by an insane puppet master. They swung towards the dark chasm. One by one, the pilots stalled their rotors and plummeted gracelessly down into the blackness. Whatever it is we found out here, it's not natural. It's not of this earth. We cannot fight it or send it back to wherever it came from. I want you to pray. Pray for our missing comrades. Pray for the pilots we've lost. Pray for us as we journey down to where they fell. But most importantly, pray that whatever dwells in that dark chasm doesn't come out. Pray that you're not next. I'm writing this from the safety of my own home, shaking terribly after what just happened. I'll give you some backstory first before we get into what happened today. My friend Hugo and I were friends since birth. We lived close to each other and went on family vacations together, so we've never really been too far apart. We were like clones of each other, knowing exactly what we were thinking or sharing the same opinions. Once we reached high school, however, things began to change in our relationship. We grew distant as we pushed ourselves through harder and harder courses. I hardly thought about Hugo during that time, until one day. Our school has an extremely large library that costs more than the school's budget. We were known across the state for it. One day, I was prying around in the nonfiction section. I found what appeared to be a fantasy book describing creatures that I couldn't even fathom. I sat down after school that day and read through it. I reached page 48 and read what it described. The humanoid mimic is a creature that mimics someone it chooses at birth. This creature will befriend its victim until they reach 18. Then, it murders its victim to give it enough strength to produce more offspring. Few researchers have revealed trustful information about the behaviors of these creatures, but newer studies suggest that the creature might prematurely murder its victim if its victim finds out they are a humanoid mimic. For some reason, I felt chills go down my spine. All I could think about was my friend Hugo, how he and I had been friends since birth. He always stayed close until now. Is he separating himself from me because he feels remorseful, knowing that he's running out of time until he has to complete his task? So many questions filled my head. I swiftly put the book back. I felt sick. I tried to reassure myself that there's no way that my friend, whom I've known since birth, would just get up one day and decide to murder me. That wasn't really going to happen. This book is just a fantasy story, misplaced in one of the largest libraries in the state. It was completely impossible. I contacted Hugo after I collected my thoughts to check in with him and asked to meet up with him in person like we used to do. He agreed, and we met up outside our school. You have to check out this book I found in the nonfiction section, I told Hugo. He obliged and followed me into the library where I found the book again. I flipped to page 48 and pointed it out to him. Hey, one of us could be a humanoid mimic, huh? I said to Hugo. Eerily, he asked why this book existed in the first place. I went to look at the back and nothing seemed to pop out to me, but Hugo saw something as his expression turned to shock. He ran to put the book back where it was. This was becoming something of concern to me at this point. Hugo, it's just a fantasy book. There's nothing to worry about, I said, attempting to calm him down. He didn't hear me and continued trying to find the open spot in the nonfiction section where I picked it from. He eventually found it and came back to me telling me never to read that nonsense again. I somewhat agreed. I shouldn't believe that either of us would be a mythical creature I read in a misplaced book. On the other hand, the way Hugo acted made me question myself. All seemed well for the rest of the day. I went to bed as usual, but I woke up abruptly at 2:59 a.m. to the sound of a fingernail tapping at my window. This wasn't normal. I'm on the second floor of my house. There was no trees around my window, and it certainly wasn't raining outside. I reluctantly got up and went towards the window, my eyes fully adjusted to the darkness at this point. I pulled the blinds, and to my horror, there it was, a face in the window, with one visible finger tapping in rhythm at my window. I jumped back from where I was. The image burned in my head of a face belonging to Hugo, an overly sized head with an uncanny smile reaching up to his ears. He had no teeth, and his eyes were bloodshot. At this point, I turned on my room light, but by then, the creature was gone from my window. My heart rate spiked. I looked down at my hands to make sure I wasn't dreaming. To my disappointment, what I'd seen was real. Just as I came to that revelation, I heard glass shatter downstairs. It was searching for me. It wasn't going to stop until I was dead. I dialed 911 in a panic, not speaking, then hanging up. From what I heard, it was traveling briskly on all fours. I hid in my closet, being quiet and shutting the door so the light wouldn't reveal my face. My phone then rang. It was Hugo. Completely stressed by this point, I picked up, not thinking. All I could hear was heavy breathing on the other end. I knew he was close, but how close was the question? I felt a drop then, confusing me as there were no pipes above my closet. I came to a realization then. It just used that call to find where I was. He was right above me now, ready to finish the job. Quickly, I took one of my wire hangers and used it as a spear to pierce its eyes. As I scrambled out of the closet, I heard it screech in pain. By this point, it woke up the rest of my family who entered my room. I was on the floor in shock. The creature was no longer in my closet. It finally left. In the evening, I called Hugo after school ended. To my surprise, he never picked up. I went to the library. Again, I found that book. Looking for information about the author, I found out that he's part of an organization that deals with mythical creatures. This would have looked like a complete scam to me if I had looked at this before last night, but at this point, it was my final hope. I dialed the number on the website and was redirected to the author. I told him my whole story, and he was very helpful, saying that since the book's creation, there was more extensive research done on humanoid mimics, revealing that if they did fail their mission, they would leave to an undisclosed location. I was relieved that Hugo, or what is now Hugo, is gone for good. Humanoid mimics are all around us, so watch your backs, everyone, or you might not be able to save yourself in time.